Good morning and welcome. This is the State Water Resources Control Board's Water Quality Fee Stakeholder Meeting. Today is Thursday, August 6, 2020. My name is David Ceccarelli. I'm the Fee Branch Chief here at the Water Boards. Today, also presenting with me is Glenn Osterhage, also with the Fee Branch within the Division of Administrative Services. Also here on the panel today is John Russell, Deputy Director of the Division of Administrative Services. So today I just kind of want to go over a little bit of logistics before we go ahead and get started. Today's meeting is being webcast. We also have a teleconference meeting phone number available, which is on your agenda. Those that have called in the teleconference number, it's on your agenda. The number is 1-888-273-3658. Please let me repeat that, 1-888-273-3658. There's a participant code of 300828. This agenda is also on our website under the fees section, under the stakeholder webpage. Again, the meeting is with the teleconference. We are asking that individuals please mute their phones. There'll be an opportunity throughout the presentation to ask questions, and we'll be unmuting the calls at that time, and you'll see that kind of at the end of the agenda there. At any time, if you have any questions, there's also an email address that's linked to our website on the agenda. Please go ahead and email your questions. We do have staff in the room that are going to be evaluating and looking at those questions, and then they will pass those questions along to us, and we'll do our best to go ahead and answer those questions. I do want to say that there's a potential that there may be a lag of time that's happening as we're presenting to what you hear. We've heard in the past, and yesterday we had a drinking water fee stakeholder meeting, and there was a potential of having, again, a lag in the time of what you hear from what we're saying. So we'll do our best to pause at times and try to catch up, so everyone's kind of on the same time pattern. If we want to just scroll down, just kind of to go through the agenda just real quick here. We'll have a discussion again about our waste discharge permit fund, which supports the water quality programs. We'll talk about the budget cost drivers. These are a list of the BCPs, the budget change proposals. We'll have a discussion, kind of briefly go through each of the cost drivers. Each of these are links to the Department of Finance's website. So if you want to see additional information about our budget change proposals, please just click on the links and it'll take you to the appropriate BCP. We'll talk about some proposed changes in the water quality certification fee structure. We'll talk about some fee alternatives. And then item number 5 is the open discussion. We'll have an opportunity to open up the phone lines and help answer questions. And then we'll talk about next steps following that. So with that said, what I'm going to do is we have Jonathan Bishop, the State Water Resources Control Board Assistant Executive Officer, on the line. And he's going to start us off and tee this meeting off and give an introduction. So Jonathan, go ahead.
All right, thank you, David. So folks, this is Jonathan Bishop. I wanted to give a little introduction because, as you all know, we're in a different year than normal with the COVID emergency and the budget, everyone's budget issues with the economy. So if you look at the very end of the document, there's a fee alternative table. The staff will go into this in much more detail later, but I just wanted to draw your attention to that group of tables. Normally, we would be only talking about option C and how we're going to distribute the costs needed to address our programs based on what our budget is. And that's what option C is here. But given the emergency, we want to hear from you all today, and we'll be talking to the board, and we want kind of your impression. If we went with a lower fee increase, something like B, we would reduce the fees this year, but we would increase the fees over the next couple of years to cover that, because this doesn't go away. Given where we are in where everyone is that something that folks are interested in? A little bit of reduction this year to have bigger increases in the following years. And so, in addition to talking about how to distribute the fees, we want to talk about, is it of some interest to the stakeholders to push off some fees? There are consequences to that. One I already talked about, which is that it'll increase the fee in the coming years because we're just essentially putting it off. The other consequence that we don't normally talk about, but is important to talk about here, is that anything less than the full fee increase means that we're going to be holding positions. It means we're not going to have to be fully staffed, which means that there'll be delays. There will be permits and customer service and inspections are going to be less. And so that's also something to take into consideration is, if you have a project that needs to move forward and you need the regional boards to, review something quickly, that is probably not going to happen if we're reducing fees. Just to give you an idea, if we look at that option A, which staff is not recommending, but the board might decide, we're talking about something around 80 positions around the state that would not be filled in WDPS. So it's my recollection, that's about a 15% reduction in staff. And option B, we're talking about 55 to 60 positions that would have to be held. So, there are some real world consequences to this. I wanted you guys to be thinking about this while you go through the details with staff and think about the option of postponing some of the increases, but what that would mean in later years. David or John, that was my introductory remarks. And is there anything else you want me to cover?
No, that sounds good. Thank you, Jonathan.
I'm going to hop off because I have other meetings, but I did want to provide that introduction to the.
Okay, thank you. This is John Russell. I'm the Deputy Director of the Division of Administrative Services. When we talked in May, we were recommending, or staff was recommending, no fee increases. We've changed quite a bit from that position. The budget that was adopted was quite a bit different than what we thought was going to be adopted. When, excuse me, when the May revision came out, the administration was proposing to withdraw a number of the BCPs, and finance was saying, pardon me, and finance and the legislature were saying that they wanted to stick with a workload-based budget, meaning a status quo, no changes. So if you were following the budget process, none of those things really happened. What did happen is that we ended up with all of the BCPs that were in the budget originally, plus the 3 that were in the May revision. So we're going to have to take a look at the finances a little bit closer, and like Jonathan said, potentially raise fees, and then the board will have to make some programmatic decisions as well. The budget that was passed, that was approved by both the legislature and the governor, like I said, had all of the BCPs in it, which programmatically indicates to us that those are priorities for the administration and the legislature, and they want us to implement them. So what you'll see today is a little bit different than our normal proposal this time of year, where we have a recommendation for the board. We haven't quite gotten there yet. We're still talking to our board members. We're still talking to our executive members, staff, as Jonathan indicated. So what we're offering right now is some various scenarios or different options for the board to consider. And like I said, we've begun the discussions with them, but we're not at the point now where we have a firm indication of which way they would like to go. So like I said, it's a little bit different situation right now from where we are in past years, where we say, you know, these are the fees or the fee recommendations that the staff will take to the board. So I just wanted to put that out there. I know this is a little bit of change of direction from what we were telling you in May, but again, the budget that was adopted is significantly different than we thought was going to be adopted, and significantly different from the proposal that the administration put forward in May. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the cost drivers and then the fee proposals, but I just wanted to sort of lay that groundwork of why we seem to be having a change in direction from our last meeting, where I think we were very clear that we were not recommending any fee increases. David or Glenn?
So before I move this over to Glenn Osterhage to talk about the Waste Discharge Permit Fund cost drivers, I just wanted to mention, again, those that are on the phone and you do have some questions and you'd like to email those in, please email them into feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. So that's feebranch, FEEBRANCH @waterboards.ca.gov. Again, we have staff that are reviewing those emails, and we'll be taking those questions as they come up. And you could also use that email address after this meeting if there's any follow-up questions that you have. Please use that email address, and we'll be reviewing those emails as they come in. So I will pass this on to Glenn to go over item number 2, the cost drivers.
All right, thank you, David. So we have attachment 1 on the screen showing the normal cost drivers that we show at our meetings here. Before I go into some of the detail there, I do want to focus in on the BCPs listed at the bottom. As we've indicated, a couple of BCPs were in the January proposed. They were not in the May revise, and they were added back in for the enacted budget. So the first 2 listed on here, the business licenses for stormwater and the freshwater and SG1 harmful algal bloom, those 2 were in the January proposed and then got taken out for the May revise, added back in. The next 2 listed, they're both the finance letters because they came in during the spring time frame, the accurate and timely assessment and the water resilience portfolio. Those were added to the May revise, obviously included in the adopted budget. The next one down, the sewer service provision for dismanaged communities, was actually a BCP that was put into the prior year's budget. It was a 2-year, so the budget year plus 1 did have some additional costs. It was in our budget for January and May. It's just the way that the numbers came through. We didn't previously report it as additional costs and additional PYs. So we're updating this to reflect it. The numbers were included into the WDR and the NPDES program. So the costing was in our budget numbers. It just wasn't reflected under the BCP changes. So those 5, along with the cannabis, we are showing cannabis as a continuation and we're also showing the authority that is going away. So we have a little additional cannabis authority, the 9.9 going to 10.5, so roughly $600,000 increase in budget authority when you net those two together. So overall, we have about $6 million worth of new augmentations into the program related to BCP or finance letters. So with that, I'm going to go up to the top part of the slide for the cost drivers. The biggest change in here from what we had before, the enacted budget did not include any type of furlough salary savings. I think most people understand the governor asked, and it was negotiated through the unions for staff to take a reduction in pay for 2 years. Those numbers are not included in the enacted budget, so we're estimating what those numbers would be. We don't have the actual numbers yet to report. For this analysis, if you look at footnote number 3, we've reduced our expenditures by $7.4 million. Again, that's just an estimate at this time of what we think the expenditure reduction will be related to salary savings for the furlough program. So with all that, we do have a little bit less of an expenditure because of that. And as indicated by Jonathan and John on their opening remarks, when we get down to the final attachment, we'll kind of talk about the alternatives for these. So for the most part, the rest of the layout is very similar that we've done before. We show in column B what we were looking for as far as fees for the last fiscal year cycle. The BCP changes, we've gone through the $6 million increase. Column D kind of gets a little convoluted because we're reducing, the $7.4 million off of normal increase in costs. The previous June meeting, we did show the pro rata, just to kind of not have this slide be so mixed up with a lot of information. We took that off, but it was roughly, I have my note here, hold on. I think it was $4.9 million of pro rata from prior years. It was removed, has been added back in, and then 1.7, so roughly, $6.6 million worth of pro rata is rolled up into the staff costs as well. And then you can see column F is our forecasted revenue if we don't increase fees. And then the rest of this shows you the column I as a projected increase. We will state for cannabis, we've always indicated that this program, revenue-wise, has been a significant shortfall from what the budget amount is. In our final slide, we're not looking at cannabis, and David can jump in with more specifics if needed, but the intent for cannabis with Cannabis Tax Fund and the waste discharge funding, we're only going to staff at the revenue level that we can support. So there are some vacancies in the program. Some staff are going to be reassigned to other activities just to keep the costs in the cannabis program down to the level that we can fund off of revenue. David, is there anything else you wanted to add for cannabis before I move on?
Yeah, just a couple of points I just want to point out, as Glenn mentioned, is that although, yes, our authority in the WDPF for cannabis is higher, we are only going to staff the amounts of our fee revenue and our other appropriations that would have been through the Cannabis Tax Fund. As the WDPF shows, though, we're projecting about $4 million in cannabis revenue. So that's the revenue that we're going to staff up to, is the $4 million. And then, as Glenn mentioned, as we get into our scenarios, we've carved out cannabis, and so cannabis is taken out of the equations that you'll see in the options at the end. So we're treating cannabis as on its own and only supporting it by the revenue from the cannabis revenue that the cannabis fee payers are paying for. So no other fee payers are paying towards cannabis. Only cannabis is paying for the staffing that we have based on the revenue that we have coming in from the cannabis permits.
Thank you, David. So in lieu of opening up the table now for comments, we'll hold that off till later, because I know when we get to that final slide, we'll have a lot of comments either related to each of the individual programs, what the impacts are on some of the alternative for the fee increases for this year versus budget year 1 or budget year 2. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump down to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 3, looking at proposed changes for the water quality certification program. Some of this, all the red writing, a lot of it is just updating some wording, clarification, making it a little easier. The main change, if we can scroll down to the next section, is related to what we call Category C. Historically, this has just been addressed for sand mining discharges, where they had an application fee and an annual fee. Staff is proposing that 2 other types of activities that normally would fall into Category A, the fill and excavation at a higher fee, be dropped down to Category C, and those include in-stream gravel mining and beach nourishment. So we've mentioned that before in previous meetings. It was under discussion with program staff. So we're going to recommend to essentially have them pay a little bit less of a fee in line with staff activities or necessary requirements based off the permits. And then Ecological Restoration, we're updating the information here based off of, I forget what it was. There's some agreement of some language changes that we're changing that to make it easier to understand and read. So the biggest change is under Category C, where in-stream gravel and beach nourishment are moving from a higher fee tier to a lower fee tier. And then again, a whole bunch of some language clarification and updates throughout the document. So that's what that one is going to be. Dropping down to the big one here, which again, Jonathan Bishop had mentioned and John Russell mentioned. So we had previously indicated our intent was to go forward with a no fee increase structure, which is the very left-hand column. For those that have the color available, it's the orange. It does show that if we do not increase fees for fiscal year 2021, the current year, it does show significant fee increases would be needed for the next budget year, we call budget year 1 cycle. I do want to state we have some assumptions in here. They're notated in the footnotes down below. The first footnote, which applies to the current fiscal year, takes into consideration the estimated furlough salary savings. So it's the $7.4 million I referenced earlier. So that is a reduction in costs. We don't know exactly what's going to be in the budget next year or the following year. So I did make some assumptions in order to try to forecast what could happen. Again, these are just estimates and forecasts. The furlough salary savings, it is a 2-year situation, so those furlough savings do carry over into budget year 1. There is no salary increases, obviously, but other costs throughout the state are going to go up. So I did add in about a 2.5% increase for other costs, rent, utilities, overhead, some indirect costs. So we do expect to see some type of increase in costs, just not normally as high as they would be since the salaries are not increasing. And then the biggest assumption that I made in this is going into budget year 2, which is footnote 3. Right now, the furlough salary savings will go away, so those salaries is roughly about 9% reduction in pay. Those get added back in. I don't know with the union as to whether or not when that expires, will salaries actually be increased per the normal processes or will they remain flat? So I went ahead and just added in a 3% salary increase just in case salaries do go up into that second budget year. So some of these numbers could change. And then I also added in a 2.5% general increase for other costs. So there's a lot of assumptions built into budget year 1 and budget year 2. But as Jonathan Bishop had mentioned, if we do not raise fees this year and we look to balance our revenue and expenditures in budget year 1, most programs are going to have significant increases. With the exception of land disposal, you're looking at anywhere from 5% to almost 14%, depending on the program. And then as we move across the table, option A, one option is to raise fees in relation to the budget augmentation, so that's the BCPs listed below. So if we look to raise the fees to cover everything with the exception of cannabis, we're looking at about $5.4 million worth of additional revenue to generate. 3 programs in particular take the brunt of those costs. That's the WDR, stormwater, and NPDES would all have increases. 3 of the programs, just because of the nature of their proportion of the BCP's that they'd be contributing towards water quality cert, ag lands, and confined animals would all have increases below 1%. It could be anywhere from 0.04% to 0.06%, so they'd be relatively minor. So with those, the budget year one numbers will be slightly lower than they would be in the current fee structure. The biggest outlier is the water quality certification. Since they don't really have a whole lot contributing towards BCPs, most of their required need would be carried over to budget year one. Moving over to option B, again, if you have the color version, it's the yellow column. We put it in here, it's roughly about 75%, so it's kind of in between. If we add for BCPs, for programs, add about half of what they need to make up that individual program shortfall. You can see that fee increases for WDR would be 8.5%, as low as 1.4 for ag lands. Again, land disposal is the one program right now that is generating enough revenue to cover these situations. So again, it kind of mitigates the out year increases. So again, focusing on the top line, WDR, the current fee structure, budget year one, they're looking at about a 12% increase. If we go with option A at BCPs, the budget year one, they're at about a 6%, so it's about half of what the need is. And then if we go to column B, WDR is about a 3%. So again, it cuts it again in about half. So a lot of it is just where do we want to have some programs fit in trying to cover. And then obviously, as Jonathan Bishop had mentioned, column C, the far right-hand column, is the full increase. Jonathan also mentioned, if you look a little bit further down, we have a couple of boxes under each structure. The first one, I had to abbreviate here to get it fit nice and neatly, but additional revenue generated. Obviously, the current fee structure, if we don't raise fees, we get zero extra revenue. That shows that we'd have about a $9.6 million revenue shortage compared to expenditures. And we would have to look to hold vacant about 100 to 110 positions in order to mitigate that structural shortfall. And as we move across to the right, option A, the additional revenue, again, is covering the BCPs, so it'd be about $5.4 million, a net shortage of about 4.2, and we'd have 75 to 80 positions that we'd have to mitigate with by holding vacant or moving staff to other work assignments outside of the Waste Discharge Permit Fund. Going over to column option B, the 75% mid-ground, again, the additional revenue generated, we now get an additional $7.2 million. The shortfall would be 2.4, so we'd have 50 to 60 positions. And then column C, it kind of looks a little strange that if you raise fees to cover the shortages, why would you have vacancy numbers listed? We have a natural churn rate on a yearly basis of vacancies as staff retire, as they transfer. Normally, we'll say it's about 5% of the program at any given time could be vacant as we're going through the hiring process. So we normally have 20 to 30 positions that are normally vacant on a rolling basis throughout the year. So we listed that there just to kind of show that, throughout the year we're going to have some vacancies, but we're going to target, if we go the full route, revenue to match expenditures. So a lot of detail here, a lot of information that we had not previously shown to stakeholders. I think the question I know David have is, we want feedback from the regulated community. Obviously, no one wants to have fees increased, but the choice is we don't raise fees this year. It's going to put a significant potential increase for next year. So we want your feedback. We do have to prep our board documents here in the next week. So I'm going to look at David. I think by the middle of next week, if you guys have any comments, get them to us as soon as you can so we can kind of get an idea of the regulated community. Obviously, you're not going to like any fee increases, but if you have to look at looking at budget year one, budget year two, is there any preferences on here? The other piece that's not included in here, and we've mentioned before, our FizCal system for accounting. They've been working to get caught up. They have actually finalized finally the 18-19 fiscal year numbers. Although I always say if you've ever done any type of system conversions, reporting out of that takes a little lag to get reports. to make sure that we understand all that data that's coming through. So they're working on getting us new reports out of that. The 1920 that just closed at the end of June, they hope to have that completed by the end of the calendar year, so by the end of December. In a normal course, when we have reports that are up to date, we usually have a good idea of what the June number is going to be by the middle of August. Accounting will always close the books after that, and there may be some changes. That's why we always do prior year adjustments, do some cleanups. But we have a fairly good idea normally by mid-August, early September, of what the prior year is. We don't have that. So we're looking through to validate what's the actual numbers as they ended 18-19, what they will end up for 19-20 come the end of the year. So we're getting close, as we mentioned before, to getting caught up with our financials. So hopefully in the next fiscal year cycle, we'll have the reports available to us that we can validate what's actually our fund reserve. You know, if we had a fund reserve, I'm just making up some numbers here, but 10 to 15% fund reserve, we have a little bit of leeway to kind of mitigate and stretch out fee increases over a number of years. Right now, we don't have a good, true picture of what the fund reserve is. So we're being more cautious right now to say we need to generate revenue based off of the budgeted expenditures with no indication of what our fund reserve is. So as we get better information, we hope to have an estimate next week of what that is, so we can go up to our exec or to our board members and say, yeah, we have a few $1,000,000 that we can kind of mitigate some of these increases in future years, but we're getting close, and we hope to be able to true that up into next year. So I don't know, David, do you have any comments you wanted to add? Yeah, so with that, I'll go ahead and head over to David, but he's just going to basically say we'll open it up to questions. Okay.
So let's open it up to questions. Right now, we currently have one email question we'll take.
Gail Delahant from California Government Affairs. Do you have a slide on which programs would be getting the PYs and how many?
Okay, so on what's on the screen here, we have the PYs listed for each of the BCPs. So obviously the one that's directly for stormwater, that one PY goes to stormwater. So the 5 PYs, the example would be under the second one down there, the BCP for the Algal Bloom program. $1.5 million, there's 5 PYs. We're indicating that the costs are going to be spread across all fee payers. I don't know, and I know we may be able to have Karen Mogus jump on here in a moment. They won't be charging directly to a fee program. They'll have their own charge task that they're going to charge to, and then we take those funds or those charges and spread them across to the fee-paying programs. So Karen, I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you're listening in, and again, we may have a delay in our the webcast to say, do you know exactly how these PYs are going to be spread versus the state board versus the regional boards? So we're going to go ahead and unmute the phone for Karen. And as a reminder, if you can, if you're on the phone, go ahead and mute just so we don't have any feedback. So we may have to wait a moment to depend on Karen's feed to see if she's up to date with us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Karen.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I'm assuming you're referring to just the new positions that were authorized in this year's budget?
Yes.
Okay. So for Division of Water Quality, there are 3 that we received positions for just water quality in general that'll hit the WDPF. And that is one of them doesn't hit the WDPF. It's the positions that will bring 10 positions in for Caltrans projects. Essentially, it's reimbursable funds through Caltrans that will pay for 3 positions at state board and at least 1 position for each of the regional boards to do the 401 water quality certification permitting for Caltrans projects. And they'll all be reimbursed under Caltrans budget, so that's not going to hit our budget at all. And I'll rely on DAS staff to let me know if I misspeak on any of these. Then there's the 6 positions that we received for the water resilience portfolio work, which is recycled water, constituents of emerging concern, as well as our pre-treatment program. Those 6 positions all reside in Division of Water Quality, State Water Board.
The 401 water quality certification.
I'm hearing myself on the web.
Permitting for Caltrans projects. That'll all be reimbursed under Caltrans budget, so that's not going to hit us.
Yeah, I think Karen's getting her own feedback.
All rely on DAS.
Yeah, I'm hearing you guys in the hearing room. I don't have the webcast.
6 positions that we received for the water resilience portfolio work, which is
well, I'll just keep going. I'll finish with the last 8 positions are for water quality assessment, for our integrated report to respond to the court case that we lost in providing timely assessment of our water quality data. Those 8 positions will all reside at the State Water Board.
All right, thank you, Karen. We'll wait for your feedback, or if you can go ahead and put yourself on. Actually, we'll have Sarah go ahead and mute the phones there. Okay. So a number of staff, we have 26 listed in here that will impact the WDPF fund itself. There are parts of the BCPs that are, one of them Karen mentioned was a reimbursable through Caltrans. It's not included in here because it is not impacting fees. So the work will be, some will be state board, some will be regional board. It just depends on the nature of the activity. We did have one request come in through to us as far as the request on the deadline for the comments to say, can we be extended to next Friday? I'm just going to say, get it to us as soon as possible. Our documents to the board clerk. Sarah, what's the actual day? I don't have my calendar in front of me. So, but the week after next, we have to have our documents up to the board clerk. So we have an internal process of going through management exec for review, legal review. So if your comments come in too late, we're already pushing up our information. We can always adjust and change, but it makes it difficult to us. So I do realize that there are some impactful changes in here, a lot of impacts to fee payers. Obviously, with the COVID situation and the economic situations, any type of fee changes, we do realize have an impact to everybody, but also trying to look at, are we going to try to mitigate some of it now and not push it all out to future years? Those are choices we want to hear back. So the sooner you can get us the information, the sooner we can try to make sure we incorporate it into any of the documents we're going to send up to exec for review before we actually go to the board in September. David, anything you want to add there?
So we currently have a few more online questions that we'll take in order.
Okay. JP Cataviella from Cogent Consulting and Communications. On page 8, can you explain again the assumptions that led to 7.3% in the final column for all options? I thought the default annual increase was 4%.
Yes, and JP, thanks for the question there. You can always reach out to me separately. So yeah, normally we try to say anywhere, realistically, it's going to be 4 to 5%, but we used to say 3 to 5%. The reason why that 7.3 is because through budget year 1, we have this arbitrary furlough salary reduction, the $7.4 million, keeping our expenditures down. That $7.4 million goes right back into the expenditure pool for budget year 2. So right there, top of my head, let's just say it's going to be a 4% change just related to that, plus your normal increases. Again, I added in that 3% salary increase. That may not happen. And then the general increase of 2.5%. So when you add in the furlough salary savings being added back in, that's the component that's higher than we normally would see in a future budget year. So really, if you look at the far right-hand column of the fee alternatives, it just happens to be the full increase. You can see budget year 1 is 2.5% because the only thing that's changing from the current budget as we have is that 2.5% I added in for general increase in costs. Budget year 2 has the 2.5%. plus it has the addition or the reversion of the salary savings and a 3% salary increase if that happens. I'm not saying it's going to happen. So again, that's why that number is higher than normal, is because we have an arbitrary reduction in cost for budget year one, that goes away for budget year two.
Okay, next question from Chuck White at Manat, Phelps and Phillips. Can you discuss column D on attachment 1 a bit more? I don't quite understand why there's shown to be a downward adjustment if the BCPs are going to be fully implemented. Why is this column showing a reduction if BCPs are fully implemented?
Okay.
Thanks for any clarification.
Yeah, we'll scroll back up to attachment 1 here. Okay. So column D, which we list as staff costs and program adjustments, you can see there's 2 footnotes in there. The footnote number 3 is the reason why it's negative, because that $7.4 million furlough salary reduction. We have that footnote in column D and E, but because we're decreasing staff costs estimated at $7.4 million, it goes by nature into the staff cost portion of the adjustments versus operational cost adjustments, pro rata, retirement, everything listed in footnote number 2. So it's employee compensation, retirement, healthcare costs, pro rata. So those costs normally are going to go up each year, but because we're reducing that column by $7.4 million, it goes into a negative number this year. But normally that's going to be a positive number in the aggregate, but it's just a 1-year reduction because of the furlough.
Okay, Maureen Daggett from ECM Services. This is a multi-part question and it pertains to the stormwater program fees. Question number 1, based on the information provided, the stormwater program generated approximately 23% of all fees. Is 23% of resources allocated to administration or enforcement of the stormwater program?
Okay, so I'm not sure where the 23% came from. If you're saying 23% of the total program, I don't have the calculation in front of me. That sounds realistic when you look at stormwater, WDR, and NPDS are all in the $33 to $36 million range. So the costs are, for that stormwater program, there is an enforcement portion of charges that do go into the WDPF. Stormwater does go out and do inspections of sites. If it's legal enforcement, that's going to be a separate charge that goes through the water boards. I don't know. And again, Karen may have to have you jump on here to let us know how the enforcement portion are charged. Some may go directly into the stormwater program. There is an enforcement portion that we call into our foundational programs. That's regional board based for some of their enforcement activities that gets charged to the WDPF. So Karen, I don't know if you heard the question. If you're on, we'll unmute the phone, and if we need to repeat the question, we will.
Yeah, I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounded, I'm not completely clear on what question. Are you referring to the enforcement charges? And if so, I agree with what you just said, that it's charged through the regional boards, through the foundational program costs, which ultimately end up hitting WDPF anyway. Was there another part of the question that I missed?
So Maureen, since we're going to get into the little details here, we'll reach out to you separately. We've got your email, so we can address your question because we want to make sure we address it correctly. We're going to start making assumptions, and it's hard in this environment. I will state, to kind of go offline here, is we may look to do the Zoom vehicle on our next meeting, would be February or March. Our program is not yet used Zoom. We actually have one this afternoon. We're going to use the Zoom platform for the first time. So it will be a little easier, I think, in the Zoom environment to have interaction with questions coming back and forth as more interactive versus a webcast. So in this environment, it's a little tough to go into some of the details. So Maureen, if you're okay, just go ahead and email back and Sarah can see that. Yeah, and we'll get to your second part of the question, but the first one, we'll reach out with you separately to make sure we address your question.
Okay, staff is proposing an increase of 5.9% in fees to cover a projected 1.9 million revenue shortfall. A, does this include the SB 205 costs, and if so, why? And why is the cost being applied to existing permitted discharges? The SB 205 costs need to be applied to only new industrial permits as a one-time supplemental fee.
So the choice here was the $175,000 related to the BCP for stormwater discharge compliance. In general course, when we get BCPs, if it's targeted to a single program, we could specifically indicate that only stormwater industrial discharges or stormwater construction discharges or stormwater municipal activities. This one is a smaller amount. The decision was just to spread it across all the programs. We periodically will work with, in this case, a stormwater program, since we have three components, to kind of make sure is the revenue coming in alignment with the work effort. It's hard because any given year, focus could be, I'm just going off my head here, it could be more focus on municipal, it could be more focus on industrial, but over, say, a 5-year period, what's the average effort within that stormwater program for each of those, I call them the sub-programs. We'll periodically look at that just to kind of make sure. We did do it a couple of years ago with this program. We kind of readjusted the fees. Instead of doing an average increase for all of the components of stormwater, we targeted based off of some estimated staff efforts in those programs. So in this case, it's $175,000 over a $35 million fund. It was a very small incremental amount, but we will take that under consideration, Maureen, going forward.
Okay, Part B, currently there's up to 3,000 NEC permits for industrial dischargers, of which the majority do not actually qualify for NEC permit options. Enforcement of the NEC permit qualifications will generate at least an additional $1 million of program revenue annually by bringing NOI permit dischargers into the NOI permit program and paying the considerably higher per fee $150 versus $1,400. Until staff can demonstrate that NEC permittees actually qualify, then fee increases should be reconsidered.
Okay, we'll take that under consideration. Thanks, Maureen. Okay, so the question was, we have some more emails, and we also anticipate people on the phone, but we'll go ahead and continue with the emails first, and then we'll move over to phone questions.
I think you got Bob's second email, but Bob Gore from the Guaco Group wants to know, could you disseminate final numbers for fund reserves, PY placement, et cetera?
Can you repeat that? I didn't. Sorry, Bob. I'll probably.
Okay. Bob wants to know, could you disseminate final numbers for fund reserves, PY placement, et cetera?
So fund reserve at this point, as I mentioned before, I can't give a hard number on the fund reserve until we get finalized reports going back 2 fiscal years. So hopefully next year, as we move forward, we'll be able to address that. PYs, and I think, Bob, if you're asking how many PYs are in each of the fund programs or each of the fee-paying programs, we used to supply some information, again, with the transfer to FisCal, our budget in our personnel offices. It's been difficult for them to keep track of all that because they don't have a tool yet. They hope to be able to recreate some of the metrics that we had before on reporting X number of PYs or stormwater, X number of PYs or confined animals, and that type. So we're a little bit behind because of the FisCal conversion, but we hope to be able to look at that. For those that want to know how many staff are actually charging to each of the programs, we could estimate it now through some back channel reports that we have. I call them dirty reports because they're just kind of ad hoc. So they may be in that 90% accuracy range. So we can give some estimates on how staff are charging within the last year or two. But as far as finalizing that, we're still waiting for the FisCal reports to get trued up.
And let me just add, and I think Lynn mentioned this a little earlier, regarding the fund reserve for 1920 that the year end just ended on June 30th. Internally, we are looking at running some estimates on that reserve. So we've been directed by executive management to look into that. So we do have staff. We have our budget chief looking into that also. We are hoping by next week we do have some estimates, and it definitely we'll run them more on a conservative side, knowing that there's a lot of pieces that are involved with, of course, our charges for personal services and contracts and all the operating expenses. Knowing that, again, the final numbers aren't going to come in till the end of the year. With that said, though, with our estimates, if we feel that we're confident on them and we're able to kind of estimate what the reserve is going to look like, that we are going to, have those discussions again with executive management and board members to help kind of build in those into our fee projections. So again, we are looking at what the status of the fund is going to look like in 1920. Again, based on our revenue projections that have come in, based on projected expenditures, the data that we have currently right now, and put some assumptions in. And if we're able to use that, we'll be able to kind of drive with that and use it as our messaging and our projections moving forward as we start to kind of finalize these options going to the board in September.
And I'll add, because I know, Bob, that you follow the drinking water and the water rights. Those programs, because they're a single program, although water rights does have the FERC component, it's a little easier for us to feel comfortable with our fund reserve projections, so we can actually use that in some of our analysis, especially going to budget year 1 or budget year 2. Both of those programs, when I say both, it's the drinking water and water rights, generally will spend their allotment. The water quality, the WDPF, there is a lot of application revenue impacts, and that's the piece that I don't have very good visibility to with. So when David says our revenue projections, specifically the water quality certification and the stormwater programs, have a lot of application revenue that comes in every year. And so we don't have a very good estimate right now to make sure our revenue numbers are accurate. So it's a tougher program. Obviously, if you look at the size, water rights and drinking water, $25, $30 million programs. The WDPF is a $170 million program. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving components that we want to make sure we have good, solid information before we start using a fund reserve in any of our projections.
Okay, Paul Peschel has a question. He's on the phone line, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute it. Paul, are you there?
Yeah, I can unmute.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I may have missed some because there was such a delay between the two, so make sure and hopefully I'm not being redundant. I had actually a number of questions. First of all, in various scenarios, you show a shortage. So maybe as a comparison, when you look at the current fee schedule and you look at the option A, is that primarily due to, I guess what I'm asking is, what is the cause of that shortage? Because if you're reducing staff, I thought that's how you were able to reduce the percentage. So what is this shortage caused by?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So the shortage, if you take out of consideration the vacancy hold for a moment, if you're looking at column A, the budget augmentations, if we do increase fees to cover the BCPs, again, we're going to generate about $5.4 million worth of additional revenue. The shortage is going to be 4.2. We can negate that shortage by holding, in this case, 75 to 80 positions vacant to mitigate that shortage. So if we don't hold any vacancies, we fully staff for the programs as allocated in the budget. we would have a structural deficit of $4.2 million. We can mitigate that structural shortage by not filling every vacancy for the year.
So if I could use it, well, so what I'm hearing is that shortage is only if you fill those vacancies.
Yes, the normal course is we would fill vacancies. The budget authorizes us to staff up and do a certain amount of workload. So on a normal basis, we would fill those positions. We do understand right now there are some economic issues out there. How much, and unfortunately Jonathan left, but Karen can probably jump on if I misstate this, how much can the water quality programs hold off on hiring knowing that they're not going to meet commitments for some of their objectives. So every staff that we don't fill, we're not going to be able to do our duties as a water board for what's required through the budget. So there's some trade-offs there. Yes, we can mitigate and not fill positions, but the trade-off is there is some required work that's not going to be done that is a priority for the water boards to take care of. So that's the balancing act.
Well, I guess the question I have in that regard, then, cannabis, you're only going to be funding at a third, but yet you're only going to work off of the money you receive. So how are you doing 3 times the work with a third the staff?
So on that one, in cannabis program, the decision has been made to only staff to the revenue level that we estimate. So there's a number of vacancies that were held last year for the shortage, and they've already identified a number of other positions that they're going to look to actually move staff out of the cannabis program into other work assignments in order to keep the cannabis program expenditures down. So that's why we pulled cannabis out of this equation, because the decision was already made, only staff to the revenue levels we have, either through the Cannabis Tax Fund or through existing annual fee revenue. Any extra staff that we have is going to have to be moved out of that program for other work assignments.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but if you're able to do it there, then it would seem to be easier in these other programs to not have that shortage, because that's a much larger impact when you're talking about only having a third of the funds as opposed to a small percentage reduction. Just an observation.
Yeah, and that's part of the equation we have to look at as the water board, and this is why it's going up through exec, and why we want the feedback is we have to inform management and executive of what's out there. Cannabis is kind of, it's being treated as its own separate program, and the decision's already been made there. The other programs within the WDPF, we have to make some calls. There is certain normal workload that we have to make sure is taken care of, but how much of uncertainty can the water boards assume if they keep more positions open than would normally be done? So again, the normal course is the legislature and the governor passed a budget, adopted a budget that says we need to staff up to do certain type of work on behalf of the state. By not filling those positions, we're not doing our responsibility as we're instructed to by the legislature or by the governor's office. So there are some trade-offs there. But yes, we are just focusing on non-cannabis on these charts because the cannabis decision has already been decided for, at least for the current fiscal year.
Well, just a couple other things. When I look at the various scenarios, and I'll use the A glance as an example, the total increase is about 12%, regardless of the scenario you look at. So if you hold the positions, then in my opinion, the current fee schedule would be fine, because you're just not having to pay the fees in that fiscal year 2021. And compounded, you're still going to pay the 4.4 and then the 7.3, if I understand that fully. The other thing, the point that I would make is, when you look at these different programs, such as option A with the current fee schedule, 4 of the programs have less than 1 or 0%. So there isn't a practical difference between current fee schedule and budget augmentation A. So I would just go with current fee schedule because it's going to be the same. Then when you go to B, it's also in essence the same because of the compounding. So why not just delay it and go with the current fee schedule? So what I'm in part saying there, because they vary by program, it'd be better to have this broken down by program, because there is a significant variation, but where each program may want to go with a different augmentation?
So yeah, putting together various fee scenarios, we could get to the nth degree here and have so many. The one that we were asked to do was you know what, the governor signed a budget through the legislature that increased the augmentations. So let's raise fees just for those because they said this year we need to fund those new activities. B is kind of the hybrid, increase for augmentations and for partial need. We could throw in, we'll call it, option B2 is let's just raise everyone by X percentage other than land disposal, or half of what their need is another option. But again, that's probably we're trying to get some feedback in here is to say, if we have to raise fees, do we just focus on BCP? Because we did that in prior years. We've done that. Prior years, we've just said, you know what, whatever program needs, so if say WDR needs 10%, let's just raise them half of what they need. So we'll raise them 5%. We've done that in the past as well. That option is just not reflected here. So that is something that we can look into as we go to our executive office to say, you know what, another option presented or requested is what would be the impacts to each of these programs if we just did a 50% need, I'm just throwing that as an example, of a program versus tying it initially to BCPs, which is not proportionally equal to every program, and then a portion of their need, which is what B does. So we'll look into that one.
And get some thoughts. Really, what I was observing, just one final comment. When you look at option A, there's really 1, 2, 3 programs that appear to create most of the shortage. The other ones wouldn't appear to have much, but since it's a composite number, it's difficult to tell. And that's really where my question came from.
Yeah.
But I'll leave it with that. I know I don't want to take up any more time than I have.
Okay. So again, A option, budget augmentations, 3 of the programs do naturally pick up more of the costs. 2 of them, WDR and NPDES, because 2 of the BCPs are only being directed to those programs. And then stormwater, because it is by nature a larger program, its increase when it adds in all of its proportions of the other ones goes up. But yeah, NPDES and WDR are larger programs. They're each in the $30 million range programs, but they have 2 BCPs, the water resilience portfolio and the second year of the disadvantaged communities for the sewer service provision are only going to be charged to those fee payers. So that's why those go up more than the others. So Paul, you have any other questions before we move on to somebody else?
No.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Okay, Bruce Howdeschelt from Northern California Water Association. Does program have an update on the number of irrigated lands in regions 1, 2, and 6? And will there be a separate stakeholder meeting on ag lands?
So Bruce, I'm pulling up a document, so give me a moment here. I know that regions 1 and 6 don't have any orders or waivers in place, so they have to continue to work on those. Region 2, which is our San Francisco Bay region, did have their first billable this past year. I'm trying to see if I actually have the numbers here. So I think Region 2, again, San Francisco Bay, sorry for those who don't know our regional designations, billed about 51,000 acres this year, so it's the first year that Region 2 came on board. Region 1, which I do believe has a fairly large number of acres, they still need to work on an order in Region 6. I know, Bruce, you'd sent an email to Brianna asking for an update, so I'll follow up with Brianna to see if she has any update on the 2 regions that have not yet developed their own order or waiver. But Region 2, San Francisco Bay, is now on board, charging some of their agricultural operations like the other regions.
And will there be a separate ag land stakeholder meeting?
Oh, I'm just going to joke, Bruce. I was hoping to go this entire fiscal year without an ag land meeting because we had so many over the years. So we can look, after we get past the board adoption in September, we can look to bring back some ag land discussions, look at, again, what's the impact of Region 2, what's the timing of Region 1 North Coast, Region 6 with their Lahontan's over Tahoe down south of Victorville. What's the timing? If they are in the process of working on that, we're talking 1, 2, 3, 4 years out for those regions. So we can look to kick off just a general ag lands discussion once we get past this September board cycle.
Okay, Bob Gore from the Guaco Group. Is water quality now adjusting future costs for Sigma Drive fallowing as high as 25% of acreage?
I don't know. So I'm getting a nod here. No, we're not adjusting for that.
Okay, Jared, I'm going to mispronounce the last name, Voskuhl, from California Association of Sanitation Agencies, has a question on the phone, so I'm going to unmute.
Okay.
Jared, are you there?
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, this is Jim Voskuhl on behalf of CASA, and I just wanted to thank Glenn and David and Don for all their assistance and help over the last few months working various proposals. And as a regulated community, we really appreciate the responsiveness and the iterating we're doing offline. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I had a couple of questions, and I think we just go sequentially on the pages. But the first one pertained to the staff cost and program adjustments, that column D on the cost drivers table. And I was curious why, and I wondered if it was a function of the number of employees, but because of the furlough and estimated $7.1 million reduction to the salary savings, I was curious why there were more savings that were realized in the disposal water quality cert and the stormwater programs, EDS programs.
Yeah, let me jump in on that, Jared, if you have any follow-up questions. So if you look at this column D, land disposal, water quality cert, stormwater are all 400,000 to 600,000, and the other ones are a little bit lower. Part of that for WDR and NPDES, because they're picking up a larger share of the new BCPs. For those that are into the weeds on how we do our processes, we do have foundational program costs. So as WDR or NPDES, in this case, as their expenditures go up, they take a little bit more of the foundational program costs. So their numbers are adjusted here. We also had the fact that the previous BCP for the sewer service provision, that was like the second year from the previous one. I'm going to have to say, I'll raise the hand and admit culpability. Sometimes this data, my spreadsheets are not designed to do some of these changes that I'm asked to do in about a day. So I do my best to try to capture it appropriately. I get these big old wonky spreadsheets from budgets. I have to kind of move data around to redirect them into the fee-paying programs. So sometimes things can kind of get out a little bit out of whack. How we did things last year, reported it, how we're reporting it this year. There are some changes that take place. And really, C and D columns, well, actually the D column, it's just kind of, I'm going to jokingly call it, it's the leftover adjustment to balance out B and C going into E. So it can look a little odd from time to time because we can change in the background how we're addressing certain charges that come across and how we roll them into some of the fee-paying programs. But yeah, it does look a little strange that a smaller program like Water Quality Cert, why do they have the biggest number of staff costs savings compared to some of the other programs? And part of that is what's the nature of the BCPs, because you'll have more costs going into, like I said, with WDR or NPDES. So we can always talk about it a little bit more offline, Jared, if you need to. But part of that is just the way some of the data comes across and how we capture it. I'm working on it to try to make it a little more efficient, but it's something that I have to continue to work on. So hopefully that answered your question, Jared. That's a lot of it's just on me.
Okay, that does help explain it, and I appreciate that one. And then the question, and it might be a follow-up to a previous question that had requested to see a different version of some of the tables. In the different fee alternative tables, would it be possible to provide a version that would show what the increase would be if it weren't that column D above showing the offset program adjustments. And I guess the issue of concern is what do the fees look like if you have the flowing, the salary reductions programs? And I guess there's maybe kind of that subsequent year. What would it look like in subsequent years when that money's not able to be carved out of the budget where it's put back in? You mentioned you put a 3% increase estimate back in there for that, but would that be the only realized increase, or would there be a sharper increase once that offset or reduction is eliminated?
Yeah, so I can't say what will be negotiated through the unions. At sometimes they could approve, staff increases. I'm just making up a number here, or say 5% increase for technical staff as an example. So I can't project what's going to be negotiated and agreed upon through the unions. I just threw a 3% in there just to try to mitigate, just in case some type of increase is added in. So we talked about the fact that all staff are taking a reduction in salary for 2 years. That's for the current fiscal year 2021 and also for budget year +1. So that salary reduction, in my terminology, reverts back. And so we increase the fund, in this case, by $7.4 million for budget year 2. And just in case there is some type of negotiation through the unions that increase salaries going into budget year 2, it could be there may be no increase. So that 3% that I added in goes to 0. It could be that it's 5%, and it may vary by classification. So analytical staff, technical staff, support staff through the various unions might get different increases. I can't project that. I'm just throwing in a number in there just to cover some uncertainty. It could be lower, it could be higher. The other one, the 2.5% general increase, that's just a number I picked out. It could be argued that maybe that's a little too high. Maybe it should be 2%. Again, that's for the indirect costs, the overhead, and some of the other costs. Again, I don't know what those costs are actually going to be 2 years from now, or actually for next year as well. So I'm just putting in some type of additional costs. What I don't want to do is project out with no increased costs, because we would probably assume that somewhere along the line we're going to have some additional state costs that are going to be increased, even though our salaries are being reduced. I don't know, Jared, if that actually answered your question or just made it worse.
It kind of does, but admittedly, I'm not an accountant, so some of the future projections, I guess, if rephrasing the question would help. To show what the fees would be.
Hey, Jared, I'm going to jump in on you here. Can you try to? We can't hear you very well. I'm trying to turn my ear to an invisible microphone or speaker. So can you speak a little closer to your phone?
Sure, I'll try.
Much better.
Is there a way to show what the fees would be if there weren't the program offsets for this year? And I'm looking at the fee alternative tables, essentially like a column C showing the full increases. But what those would look like if there weren't that column D above with the offsets because of the changes this year to the budget.
So you want to know what the fee increase would be, and I'm going to ask Sarah if she can jump into the cost driver table we presented in June. I'm not sure if we had those percentages in there. So, yeah,
well,
we're going to try and
pull up. March was about an 11% increase, but for only 2 of the BCPs, and then the June version had 2 different BCPs, and it was still around 11%.
Yeah, so I didn't realize I'd printed out. Never mind, so I've got it here. We're not going to put it on the screen, but I forgot that I printed out a copy of the June cost driver. So if I get your question correctly, if we did not have furlough salary savings, which is reducing our expenditures, what would the fee increase need be if we had to do a full fee increase? So if we look at columns, option C, the full increase, I'm just going to focus in on WDR since it's the first one. With the salary reductions, if we did a full increase for that program, it would go up 9%. Back in June, and this is prior to some BCPs coming in on the enacted budget, we were looking at about a 14% increase. So about 5% higher for WDR as it relates to the fact that we didn't have furlough salary savings, and there was a BCP that was in January that had been removed. So I'm going to say roughly add 5% to most of these programs in column C, option C on the fiscal year 2021, whatever number is reported there for that fee program, add in roughly 5%, and that would be a pretty good target of what it would be if we didn't have the salary savings. Did that help you out, Jared?
That was a little bit. I think the January/March budget had the harmful algal blooms BCP and the stormwater license, which were left out of the June one.
Yeah, it's So in the January proposed budget,
an 11% increase for those.
Yeah.
So then it was like that being a 25% increase for this year. If I was in these offsets from the furloughs.
Kind of got cut out there, Jared. So again, part of the issue we had is, as John Russell had indicated early on in his comments, is we weren't anticipating these BCPs necessarily being in the enacted budget. There were two. When I say two, I'm leaving out the cannabis continuation. There were two other BCPs in January that were removed for the May revise. There were two finance letters added in to May. So again, we had two in there. We took two out, but we added two more in for May. And then in June, those other two came back. So we actually have four new BCPs in play for this year, where each of the two previous iterations of the budget, there were two BCPs in play. So there is some additional costs there, yet we're now projecting in some salary savings. So again, this is kind of, can I show what the fee increase would be if the furlough salary savings were not there? Yes, but that's not the reality of what we're looking for. But roughly you can add 4 or 5% to what's in the column or what's in the fiscal year 2021 under the C full increase column. If you want to know what the increase would be as it was in January, you're missing two finance letters. If you're looking at the numbers that we presented in June, you're missing two BCPs that were taken out from January. So there are some missing pieces of the puzzle to each of those prior meetings that we presented information.
Is it as simple as just adding them together, or not that simple?
I couldn't make that out, Jared.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would it be as simple as just adding those together, or not that simple?
I think if you just want a quick hit number, add 4 to 5% to what's in the full increase column for this year is what the fee increase would be needed if we did not have the furlough salary savings.
Okay. And then as previously, and I know it's hard to project it out, but in a subsequent year, what offset are those cost savings? There'll be an additional increase beyond any other programmatic changes or new additions that are added. That would go back in.
Yes,
Okay.
and normally we would project, if we recommend a full fee increase, budget year 1 and budget year 2, I think we've been defaulting to 4% is what we normally show in those two columns. But because of the nature of salary savings being in play for 2 years and then going away, we had to move away from that 4% number to reflect a reduction for budget year 1, but an increase for budget year 2 because the costs come back.
Okay. Just last comment, and I'll yield before I again appreciate the time here. Just more generally from our members' perspective, there is a pretty wide-ranging position on whether it would fee increases done, or a smaller amount versus the full amount. And so I will check that out to see if there really is a predominant view amongst us. We do appreciate being a part of the dialogue. And I think generally our members, obviously don't have any more fees. And we prefer, especially in a year like this, to not have those fee increases. But having some ability to predict year to year is always appreciated from our folks. And the fees have go up a lot year. I remember talking about, maybe where it ends or how much more than there. But we'll take this back, and I think I have a pretty good grasp on a lot of the issues highlighted. So thank you again for the presentation today, and we'll talk offline.
All right, thanks, Jared. Before we go on to the next question, I do want to remind, if you do have some comments as to, different types of the fee increase proposals or alternatives that we have on here. I don't want to call them proposals yet, they're alternatives. Let us know as soon as possible, because again, we have to incorporate those viewpoints on what we're going to put together for our board documents. Sarah, next one. Okay.
Okay, Gail Delahant from Western Growers Association. I may have missed this explanation, but can you explain the difference between the vacancy hold numbers versus the 26 new PYs? The chart goes from 101 to 111 in the current fee structure to 20 to 30 in the last chart C.
Yeah, and Gail, if we need to address this, so I was reminded that our meeting is scheduled to end at 10. We do have a little extra time that we can go over that. We have to be done for sure by 10:30, no matter what. So we'll try to get through these. Okay, so the option C, the full increase, that 20 to 30 number down there, doesn't really relate to the numbers that are indicated to the other options. That 20 to 30 is kind of our normal run or churn rate as far as normal vacancies that are open at any given time within this fund. The numbers, if you start on the current fee structure, 101 to 111, essentially we took 26 off of that. That's why we got 75 to 85. I think if I do my math, 75 off of 101 is 26. When you start going into option B, now we're looking at the Bcp augmentations and a portion of the other ones. We start scrunching in these numbers. But these are just estimates on the number of vacancies. We do have a couple of different costs per PY. Most BCPs, I believe, now are written at $200,000 for each staff. Our actual internal costs, when we add in all of the indirect costs, is more like $235,000 of costs. So depending on which costing method you use, it impacts the number of projected vacancies that would have to be held. So that's why we have a range in here, plus the fact that we have normal vacancies that come open throughout the year. So the easiest one is option A. We just took 26 off. B is kind of more, I wouldn't say wishy-washy, but it's kind of in between, trying to estimate what the actual number would be. The full increase, again, that's just showing our normal, typical number of vacancies throughout the year.
Debbie Webster from the Central Valley Clean Water Association. In the last meeting, you also described that there was a utility cost for the power lines that was associated with the WDR and or NPDES programs. How much does this impact the fee increases?
So Debbie, if that's the SB 901 related for the wildfire mitigation, so that was a new fee we put into place last year. We haven't determined yet if fees are increased for water quality certification. Will that fee be impacted? I'm going to say I don't know yet, or if we're just going to increase the fees on the other fee payers. That's a decision that we're still talking about internally as to kind of in line with the stormwater one. Do we target certain fee payers within a program, or do we put it across everybody? But that program was new. We'd have to validate. There was a kind of a grandfather process of certifications that were already paid for versus what they're going to have to pay on the per mile charge. So that's still open for discussion.
Maureen from ECM Services. She needs to know what is the current staffing for each of these programs at both the regional boards and the state board levels, and how many vacancies exist for each staffing level. This information is important to make an informed decision about which implementation plan.
So I'm going to say right now, again, because of FisCal, we don't have fully validated reports. I will note that even though one program in a short term may have a number of vacancies, program, when I say program, that's the water quality program, can identify certain priorities and move staff around. So just because one program may have 5 vacancies today, program could say, you know what, that workload is a priority. We're going to move staff into those positions, and now it needs another program that will technically have the vacancy. So that's part of the nature of the turnaround of working through staff priorities and staff workloads. But it's a number that we used to report, and as I think it was Bob Gore had brought it up, we can estimate how many PYs or personal years are being charged to each program. But without the true reports from FisCal, it's tough for our budget office to report that. I don't know if David, if you have anything you wanted to add there.
Yeah, as Glenn mentioned, I mean, it gets a little tricky right now without having the fiscal reports. We're estimating internally that there's about 600 staff that are charging to the Waste Discharge Permit Fund. And of course, that's spread out through all these programs. And as Glenn mentioned, at any given time, there's about a 5% vacancy rate, and that's why kind of on the last column C, 5% of 600's 30 staff. We are working on, as Glenn mentioned, kind of the end of the year, getting these fiscal reports to kind of break down each of the programs and the positions. So we'll be able to provide that with more detail based on those charges in the given year here.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and look at the previous tables that we've provided and see if we can update those, because we should be able to provide you with the budgeted number of staff in each of those, but the fiscal issues come in telling you how much we've actually spent. But on the budgeting side, we can certainly do that and tell you how many vacancies are in each of those programs.
Okay, and JP, just wanted to know what the comment deadline was, but I believe we're going to restate that at the end of the meeting, so I'll move on to the next question.
Okay.
Okay. Sharon Green from LACSD. I may have missed the explanation about reserves, so I apologize if this is duplicative of material you covered. But can you please explain what the existing reserve amount is and what the proposed reserve is, if any? There's multiple questions, so I'll stop there.
So our normal target for this fund is, historically, it's gone down to 5%. I think the last year or two, or prior to this one, we notched it down to 4%. It's a very large fund, so even 4% of $170 million is still a large number. So we target 4 to 5% as our minimum fund reserve. As indicated, and Sharon, again, if you didn't hear this before, we don't have very accurate information currently because of our accounting reports out of FisCal. We have an estimate, but there's a lot going on with the conversion to FisCal. We had some type of billing issues that we had what's called advanced allocations. It got changed the way we did it out of the CalSTARS program to the way it's done in FisCal changed. So our accounting had to change how they allocate some revenue. So it did impact current year or fiscal year. So those are all the adjustments that we're waiting to get finalized reports for to really know what our reserve is. So all of this data here, information on these projected fee increases, is really just looking within the current budget year cycle. What's our budgeted allotment with salary savings? What's our projected revenue? And that shortfall is the percentages we're showing here. Again, once we have validated reports, David mentioned we're hoping to get an estimate sometime next week. If it's healthy enough, then we can maybe recommend we can defer. Again, when we defer, we're not getting rid of it. We're just pushing it off to a future year or mitigate it over a couple of years versus assuming the entire fee increase this year. But right now, since we don't have a comfortable number, we're not putting that into our calculation. I think John wanted to add.
Yeah, really quickly, let me just say 1 or 2 minutes about FisCal and why that's such an issue right now. Previously, we had a separate budgeting system that would tell us all the data that everybody is asking for. You know, region A, you have this much money and this many staff allocated. That was a totally separate system from our accounting system that we used to track, you know, how many staff were allocated in each program and where they were allocated. When FisCal came along, the state said this is supposed to be our one-size-fits-all and does-all accounting system. So please get rid of all these little ancillary or side systems that are doing things that FisCal should be doing. So we had to stop doing that that budgeting system that we had that was working fairly well, in the hopes that Fiscal would do the same thing. So far, Fiscal has not been able to pick that up. So we've been having to do a lot of that manually. I don't want to give you the impression that we have no idea what our fund reserve is and we have no idea where our staff are or where they're charging to. We do have that in a general sense, but we don't have the automated system that we can just run the queries that we used to have. That I used to be able to go into our system, and in 2 or 3 minutes I could tell you exactly where every staff person was, for example, the WDR program, how much each region was allocated, how many staff, and how much they had actually spent as of a month or two ago. So we no longer have that. We're working to make Fiscal give us that data. Implementation has been really tough up to this point, and I don't think it's going to get any easier here for a little while. But we'll go and revisit the information that we did have, which is probably still mostly correct, and then update it. Again, it'll be a sort of a manual update, but we'll take a look at what information we can provide to you.
All right, thanks, John.
Okay. Can you explain why the full increase option C still has a vacancy hold of 20 to 30 positions? Is that part of the state's policy on staffing for this fiscal year, i.e. not filling existing vacancies?
So again, that number there, the 20 to 30, is just on a normal course for our agency. We're going to have vacancies that are in the process of going through the interviews and being staffed. So if staff retire, if staff transfers, those positions become vacant. And there's a natural time frame, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, that we have to go through to fill those positions. So it's just the nature of the fact that staff do change assignments. That's the normal vacancy holds that we have. So we just wanted to show that we always have a little bit in there, but it is just the nature of the fact that we're never fully staffed.
And this is related also. Can you clarify the distinction being made between not filling vacancies and actually reducing staff? You mentioned potentially transferring staff from WDPF funded programs to other programs. This information would be helpful in trying to assess the impact on programs, i.e. are some of these positions already vacant?
So go ahead.
Yeah, so briefly, the only way we can actually reduce staff is through the BCP process, do a negative BCP and say, we no longer have the need for X number of staff. So what we're talking about here is temporarily holding positions open or vacant for that cost savings. As an example of actually reducing staff, the BCP for the cannabis program this year was 116 positions, down from 120 before. So we did have a -4 reduction in staff in that case. But in this case, we're just saying we're going to artificially hold vacancies open to create some forced cost savings for us.
And I also want to add is when I say we'll move staff to another program, it's moving into a program that has vacancies. We can't just move staff and charge another program above their allotment. So if program X has 2 vacancies, program A that we're trying to hold some vacancies open, if the staff is qualified and they're able to do the other workload, they could transfer them over as a priority to work on another assignment, just to arbitrarily, like John said, hold some vacancies open to force some savings in the short term.
Maureen from ECM Services, is there any surplus left over from the 1920 budget?
So with surplus, that would go into what we call our fund reserve. So if we have more revenue for 1920 versus our expenditures, that would roll into an increase in our fund reserve. So again, we don't have actual 1920 numbers yet. Prior years, I would get monthly reports. Generally about 6 weeks after a month ended, we can kind of get an idea of the revenue numbers. I haven't seen a revenue number report for almost 2 years now. I have to wait to year end or just kind of use my invoicing data. Again, I don't see application revenue. That doesn't come through my group. So I have to estimate that. So again, we're waiting to get these fiscal reports for year end for, again, 18, 19, and 1920 finalize so we can true up our fund and really know what's in our fund reserve.
Last question. What level of BCP request are you anticipating for the next year? My concern is that, this is Debbie Webster from the Central Valley Clean Water Association. My concern is that we are already seeing significant increases for this year's BCPs.
Yeah, so we are just starting that process right now, and obviously I'm going to put out the disclaimer that the BCP process is confidential. But at this time, we've been told not to expect any BCPs to be approved unless they are either COVID-19 related or revenue generating BCPs. So based on the instructions we've been getting from both finance and from agency, I anticipate that we'll be submitting very few, if any, BCPs. And that's just based on the direction we're getting from the governor's office.
Anything else, Sarah? Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to David to wrap us up and to also give an update on when we want to have comments in.
So we've had a couple of kind of internal discussions on comments, and we definitely appreciate feedback, comments regarding these options, and of course, if there's other options that you have. Because we have to make some decisions and because we have to get our documents ready for the board meetings, and of course, we'd like to take your comments and be able to provide those and discuss that with our executive management and board members. For the comment period deadline, we're requesting next Wednesday, which would be August 12th of close of business. If you'd like to submit them earlier, we'd really appreciate that. Take in mind, if you do submit them after the 12th, we'll do our best to, of course, submit those and let our board members know. However, we're going to have to make some decisions. And we take our stakeholders' feedback into our decision making. So again, next Wednesday, that'd be Wednesday, August 12th by close of business. You can submit those to the fee branch website, which is again, feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. And in the meantime, if you have any further questions for Glenn and I, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions or comments, and we can do our best to get those explained. I know we had a few follow-ups on some budget information, so we'll do our best to work internally to get that information. Let me pass it on to Glenn just if he has any further information there.
It's actually, I got a laptop here, so it's kind of interesting trying to respond to stuff and comment at the same time. So as David indicated, we'll look for comments next week. We do have to start getting our documents together to get review through our exec and to our board members for the meeting. Right now, we're anticipating going to the board on September 15th. The board meeting for the fee adoption, that would both be for this meeting for water quality fees, that'd be WDPF, water rights, and if needed, drinking water, all of those programs. We're targeting the September 15th board meeting for fee adoption.
And just regarding the board members, I think most of you guys are familiar with our documents are usually sent out to the public 10 days prior to the board meeting. The agendas are posted, so there is a comment period, and all the instructions are on the board's website. For those who've been participating or been tracking the recent meetings because of COVID, those are all Zoom meetings at this time, so there are instructions on how to participate on those meetings and get the information in advance on how to comment and how to log in. So though definitely I would suggest that you review that information in advance. And if there's not any other questions from the forum, if John, do you have anything?
There's one question. Do you want to answer it?
Yeah, we can go ahead and answer it. Go ahead.
Okay.
We have one more question, so we'll take this question.
Okay. Paul Peschel, who was on the phone earlier, based upon the responses to questions, does that mean that the net shortage for the current schedule is based upon a vacancy hold between 71 and 91 as in option C, it is 0 with 20 to 30.
Can you repeat that so make sure I get it correct?
Based upon the responses to questions, does that mean that the net shortage for the current schedule is based upon a vacancy hold between 71 and 91? As in option C, it is 0 with 20 to 30.
Okay, I understand it better now. No, the rolling vacancy rate is not included in the current structure, option A or option B. Those are positions that we would have to target above and beyond the normal vacancy rate in order to mitigate the net shortage.
So before we end, I think John has some final comments here.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't say this at the very beginning, and I say it every time. If you have any questions or want more clarification or anything, don't hesitate to reach out to Glenn or myself or David. Email, a phone call, whatever you need to do to get a hold of us. This has been an abnormally weird budget year, and we apologize for all this last-minute changes in information coming at you, but we've been rolling with the punches here ourselves as best we can. So if any of this was unclear, please feel free to reach out, and we'll try to help you as much as we can.
One last check, Sarah, anything? Okay, you want to sign us off, David?
So I just want to thank everyone for participating today. We do appreciate any feedback, comments that you provide to us. Again, as John mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions. Thanks again.